All right. It is 2:01, so I want to respect people's time and get underway. I see our participant list is growing and growing. Really excited to have you joining us today. So this is Celine Coggins. I'm Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education, and I am super excited to be joined by Dr. Kirabo Jackson of Northwestern University and Janet Lopez, Senior Program Officer at the Rose Community Foundation. So today we're going to talk about teachers, we're going to talk about teacher quality, we're going to talk about students and predictors of student success. I am super interested and excited about this conversation, and I hope you all are too. So when I joined this network, a little is as we started to review the results of our benchmarking report was that the topic of teacher quality was a topic that had really kind of slipped in terms of funder interest and funder movement. I saw the topic of assessment as a topic that had kind of slipped in terms of funder interest and movement. But we saw the issues that relate to student long-term success, student discipline, really rising in terms of interest among our members. And so Dr. Jackson's work really marries the two of those. As someone who spent my work life before GFE on teacher issues, I thought this was a great way to kind of marry the things that this network has been doing to the directions that it's headed in. I'll say that one of the greatest kind of validators for the work of Dr. Jackson that I've ever heard is, I think most of you know, I teach one course a year at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I teach a course on teachers, and I had all of my students kind of flood into my classroom one evening and say, oh my goodness, we just saw the most profoundly important lecture that we've ever heard of on the role of teachers in supporting students' long-term gains. So thinking beyond kind of traditional value add and tests and thinking about the role of teachers in long-term student success. And so I was dying to hear that lecture that I missed because I was doing my day job. And so that was one of the reasons among many that I invited Dr. Jackson to join us today. He has another paper out, I just thought for the first time today, really on kind of what makes a good school, what do parents prefer when it comes to schools that increase test scores or schools that help to prepare their students for the workforce and deter them from crime. He's got, I think, a lot to say on a lot of the things that you all care about. So I'm really excited to turn things over to Dr. Kirabo Jackson.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm happy to be here. Just to begin, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes just about a few papers that I have on the broad topic of thinking about how we measure the quality of teachers and also the quality of schools, and sort of thinking beyond the test. So I just sort of want to sort of tee up the conversation with two quotes that I think classify the way two different views of education that I think is often our play here. So the first is the sort of contemporary view of education, which is of reading, writing, and numeracy and content knowledge. And here's a quote from Hall Douglas. And the quote is that a good teacher is one who is best able to get learners to master the content of the school subject. From this perspective, a good teacher is one who's able to get students to do well, basically on the test. But I think if you think from a sort of a broader historical perspective, the reason we have public schools, the reason that we spend public dollars and we tax individuals to fund schools is not necessarily to have individuals who can read and write and sort of do mathematical computations, but it's really to educate an entire population. And I think from this broader perspective, this quote sort of summarizes it very well. A good teacher is one who thinks properly in terms of the preparation of young people for life. Preparation of young people to perform well in the situations they will face as citizens, as workers, as members of homes, in their leisure life, and in their attainment of physical and mental health. And I think when you take this sort of broader view of what the education system is about, and you sort of think about, well, what are the things we should be measuring to evaluate whether we're doing well or we're not doing well, you probably come to the conclusion that perhaps test scores is one component of that, but it may not be the whole thing. So I want to sort of set this up a little bit by talking about one paper that I did. This is actually not based in the United States. This is based on research that I've done in Barbados with Dieter Baumann. And what we did was this is sort of an interesting educational system in Barbados. What happens is individuals apply to secondary schools at the age of 10, and they take an examination, and based on this examination, they get assigned to a secondary school. Now, every single secondary school has a test score cutoff, above which one gets assigned to the school that they want to go into, and below which they don't. So you can sort of think of this as this kind of arbitrary cutoff, and you can sort of line up everyone's test score relative to the cutoff to the school they want to go to. And if they score right above the threshold, they get it. So if you look at this sort of slide over here, you'll sort of see that individuals, if you sort of center their incoming test score at the end of 5th grade, at the test score cutoff of the school they want to go to, individuals are much more likely to get into the school they want to go to as their test score goes from below the cutoff to above the cutoff. Now, if you think that getting into one of these schools, these preferred schools, has a positive impact, through the same threshold, we should see improvements in outcomes as well. And what we found was in Barbados, even though parents all clamored to try and get their kids into these schools, if you looked at their test scores 3 years later, they didn't actually move very much. And you can sort of see that in terms of past the secondary school examination, we don't really see any appreciable jump in outcomes at all. But as we follow these individuals over time, we found that if you looked into their test scores, or if you looked at how they did on the school leaving exam, taken 5 years later, their outcomes actually were much better. And if you looked at their outcomes in terms of whether they were gainfully employed, whether they basically how much money they earned, whether they were in a job that was in a sort of a managerial role or something of that nature, their outcomes were much better. So our takeaway from that is that, if you look at schools and you say, well, we don't really find that these schools are improving test scores, therefore they must not be good schools, that in many cases may not be the right conclusion to draw. And this sort of told us that when you want to look at school quality, you have to really think a little bit more holistically about what exactly we're talking about. So the takeaway from this paper is that, absence of a test score effect does not mean absence of an effect. And that evaluations of schools and teachers based only on test scores may sort of miss the point. So we're going beyond this. So I think sometimes you might think, well, what you're saying is that we should look beyond test scores to see what schools are valuable. I'm saying that, but I'm also saying that an absence of test scores does not mean an absence of effect. So that we really have to be very cautious about thinking about what we're using for evaluating schools. So how might we figure out which schools and teachers are going to improve outcomes in the long run? So first, I'll sort of talk about one study that looks at teachers specifically in North Carolina. So this is a study that I did that is sort of motivated by the fact that if you look at the research out there, there's a pretty large body of research that demonstrates that non-cognitive skills not captured by standardized tests such as adaptability, self-restraint, and motivation are really important determinants of adult success. Now, the term non-cognitive, I think, is somewhat controversial. Some people refer to these as socio-emotional skills or soft skills. In fact, I don't know why they call them non-cognitive. Clearly, things are happening in the brain, but we're just going to use a terminology that is common amongst economists. But basically, it's pretty well documented and well established that these things matter a lot. And we also know that they are not very well measured by test scores. So I think this literature provides sort of a reason to think that interventions may actually have really positive impacts on skills that may go undetected by test scores, but nonetheless be really important for long-run success. These sorts of skills might explain some of the results I just showed you about these schools having these positive impacts on long-run outcomes, despite not having any impacts on test scores. So what I did in this study was try to come up with a way to measure, or at least proxy for some of these soft skills in ways that are not well measured by standardized tests. So what I did was I combined a whole bunch of behaviors that are actually readily available in many administrative data sets. So the first was I used, the study was focused primarily on 9th grade students. And the question was for individuals who are just entering high school, what happens when they get basically assigned to a teacher who improves a bunch of behaviors in 9th grade. So focusing on 9th grade students, the key measures that I sort of used were grades. I used grades in 9th grade and grades in 10th grade. I used whether they were retained in 9th grade, that is sort of held back. I used absences in 9th grade, and I also used the number of disciplinary outcomes, disciplinary suspensions that they had in 9th grade. So someone sort of meant, when I talked about this paper once, they said, well, you should turn this into a cool little acronym, and they came up with this GRAD idea: grades, retention, absences, and discipline. These four things sort of combined are going to be sort of a behavior index that's going to summarize, to some extent, behaviors that students exhibit that are potentially going to be predictive of their long-run success that are not well measured by test scores. And the logic behind this is really pretty straightforward. The basic idea is, if you take two students, it's pretty common to say, well, if I have two students and one or two sets of students, I should say, and one set of students tends to have higher test scores than the other, you might be willing to make the sort of the claim that probably the set of students who have higher math scores probably know more math than those that don't. By the same sort of argument, you say, well, if I have a set of students and they come from the same basic socioeconomic background, they come from similar families, they attend similar schools, but one set of students tends to show up to class on time, they're not getting into trouble, they're handing in more assignments, you might think those students are sort of a little bit better adjusted and they have a stronger orientation towards academic work than the students who don't. So that's sort of the basic logic behind using these as a proxy for these sort of less tangible skills that are not well measured in test scores. So what I do in this paper is I'm going to basically estimate 9th grade teacher effects on basically math scores and English scores, but also on this sort of GRAD index. I'm going to take these four things and turn them into an index and estimate teacher effects on these things using value-added models. So I'll go a little bit into how that works technically in the next slide. And then once I've sort of identified those teachers that improve the behaviors, and I've identified those teachers that improve test scores, I'm going to ask the question, to what extent does being assigned to a teacher or having a teacher that raises behaviors, that improve behaviors, how much does that improve long-run outcomes as measured by high school completion, and how does that compare to the effect of having a teacher who improves test scores? And are they necessarily the same teachers? So just very briefly, I know many of you probably are familiar with value-added models, so I'll very, very quickly talk about them here. So you don't necessarily, when you compare teacher A to teacher B, you don't want to just look at the outcomes of teacher A and compare them to the outcomes of teacher B, because students are not randomly assigned to classrooms, and it's possible that teacher A might serve students who are less well prepared than teacher B, and you don't want to penalize the teacher for that. So the logic of value added is that if you have enough data on several students, and you can collect very, very rich information about all the students, for every single student you collect things on, for example, their test scores in the previous year, whether they were suspended the previous year, their parental education, their gender, ethnicity, and a whole host of things. For every single student, you can sort of predict how well each student would likely perform at the end of the year, and you can use that as your benchmark. And the more data that you have, the more information you have about the student, the more precise your prediction of how well a student's going to perform is going to be. With that information, you sort of basically what you're going to do is you're going to look at test scores at the very beginning of the year, and you're going to sort of make a prediction of how well you would expect every student to perform at the end of the year based on all the things that we observe about that student. And to the extent that someone's actual achievements, in this case, we're talking about test scores, to the extent that an individual's test scores exceed what you'd expect, that student is sort of overperforming the benchmark. Now, of course, if there's only one student who does better than expected, that could just be for random chance. It could be something special about that student. They could have gotten lucky on the test. But if systematically you find that in a particular classroom, all students or the vast majority of students are outperforming their benchmark, and we're seeing that teachers are able to have their students outperform the benchmark year after year after year, it's reasonable to say that there's something going on in that classroom that the teacher is doing that is generating these benefits, and we call the extent to which students systematically outperform expectations basically teacher value added. So I'm going to basically identify or estimate teacher value added both in terms of test scores and also in terms of these behaviors. So this first sort of takeaway here is once I've sort of estimated these two things, the first question is, are they the same teachers? So I think a lot of people have the view that, well, if you're an excellent teacher, you must be excellent at everything. So the same teachers that raise test scores are necessarily the ones who do well in terms of improving student behaviors. And the results basically don't bear that out. So what this figure is showing you is I've sort of broken up the teachers in terms of how well they perform in terms of improving behaviors. So we have the bottom third, the middle third, and the top third. And we're basically just sort of asking the question. So among the teachers who are in the bottom third of the distribution, sort of the worst third teachers if you will, in terms of improving, or say the least effective teachers in terms of improving behaviors, are they also the least effective teachers in terms of improving test scores? And here we actually don't see very much. So if it were the case that the best teachers were basically good at everything, we should see that those blue bars in the middle go from very, very low to the middle to the top, as you sort of go from the worst teachers to the best teachers in terms of improvement, in terms of behaviors. You should see we should also be going from sort of the worst teachers and towards the best teachers in terms of test scores, and we actually don't see that. Instead, what we see is that if you look at sort of the top third of teachers in terms of effectiveness at improving behaviors and the bottom set of teachers in terms of improving behaviors, there's considerable overlap in how well they perform at improving test scores. So the takeaway from this is that some teachers improve test scores, some teachers improve behaviors, and there's not a lot of correlation between those two teachers, or just those sets of teachers. And now, to be very, very clear, I'm not saying that the teachers who are good at improving test scores are bad at improving behaviors, just that knowing that a teacher is effective at raising test scores does not give you much additional information about whether that teacher is effective at improving behaviors and vice versa. So if that's true, what that means is that when we sort of start classifying teachers or identifying teachers as being effective, and we sort of consider effectiveness at raising test scores as being sort of analogous to effectiveness, what we're doing is we're potentially missing a lot of important information about things that teachers are doing that potentially have important outcomes for the students. So the second question is it the case that once you've accounted for the teacher's effect on test scores, does their effectiveness at improving these behaviors matter for long run? And that's what this is showing you here on this slide. So what this is showing you here is basically if you compare the blue bars and the orange bars, the blue bars is telling you what is the effect of going from a teacher who's sort of the average teacher to one who's basically at the 85th percentile of the effectiveness distribution. Sort of going from an average teacher to one who's in the top 15% of teachers, a really effective teacher. So if you do that in terms of test scores, going from an average teacher in terms of raising test scores to one who is very effective at raising test scores has a relatively small effect on one's GPA in 12th grade. It has a small effect on the likelihood of graduating from high school. It has a small effect on the likelihood that a student takes the SAT 4 years later, and it has a relatively small effect on the likelihood that someone is going to have report intentions to attend college. Now, to be clear, the effect is not zero, so it is positive. Having a teacher that raises test scores does increase the likelihood that you're going to go to college. It increases the likelihood that you take the SAT. It increases the likelihood that one is going to graduate high school. But the effects are relatively small and, in fact, are tiny in comparison to the effects of having a teacher that is very effective at at improving behaviors. In contrast, basically, the effect of having a teacher at the average at the effectiveness distribution at improving behaviors compared to a highly effective teacher is about 10 times as large than the effect for test scores. So the takeaway from here is that knowing how well a teacher is doing at improving behaviors gives you a lot better information about the extent to which teachers are improving long-run outcomes than knowing whether a teacher improves test scores. So another way to sort of summarize this is that 93% of teachers in the top 10% with respect to graduation, that is, the teachers who are most effective at improving high school graduation, 93% of those are also in the top 10% in terms of improving behaviors. In comparison, only 20% of those who are the most effective at improving high school completion are also in the top 10% at improving test scores. So we do have some predictive for teacher impacts on test scores, but it's much smaller than what you'd expect. And it's much smaller than how much you could predict using behaviors. And you sort of see a similar effect here also when you look at the bottom end of the distribution. We're also much better able to predict teachers that are highly ineffective at improving these long-run outcomes by using their effects on these behaviors as opposed to using their effects on test scores. Okay, so the takeaway from this is that test scores miss a lot. And to be clear, I'm not saying test scores are useless. They do measure something and they're absolutely valuable, but I'm saying there's a lot of information about students that we're not currently using that I think could be very, very advantageous if we were to leverage it for policy purposes. So I think another thing that I want to sort of point out is that we may want to take this and say, well, you've measured behaviors. Are there other things we could also use to sort of identify things about students that are not well measured by test scores. So I want to talk about a second paper that is still a work in progress, that is using data from Chicago Public Schools. So we're using data from Chicago Public Schools, and we're basically using survey measures of student effectiveness. Survey measures of student socio-emotional learning. So this is work with some co-authors, Shanette Porter, John Easton, Alyssa Blanchard, and Sebastian Kikio. And we're basically going to explore if survey-based measures, which a lot of schools are now starting to roll out to measure socio-emotional learning, if they're sort of useful to predict impacts on long-run outcomes in ways that are not well measured by test scores. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate school value added. So we're not looking at teacher value added in this context. We're looking at school value added. So we're going to estimate school value added on survey-based measures of socio-emotional development. And we're going to basically ask very similar questions. If you attend a school that is effective at raising these self-reported measures of socio-emotional learning, does that have positive impacts on long-run outcomes in ways that are not well measured by the school's impacts on test scores? So we're using Chicago public school data, and we're going to use psychometric measures of socio-emotional skills. And these are all based on self-reports. So we have all this survey data that's been given annually in Chicago since about 2009. And I won't go into the particular items, but basically what we found is that there are a whole bunch of questions that are essentially measuring the extent to which the school promotes hard work. They're based on questions that ask things about grit, study habits, the extent to which students are engaged in school. And we put those questions together and create basically a promoting hard work index. There are a whole other set of questions that basically talk about school connectedness, belonging at school, which have also been found to be important components of the schooling environment. And we put those questions together and came up with a basically social well-being index. So we have two distinct sort of socio-emotional development measures that we're going to try and see if schools can impact those things. And the takeaway from this slide very quickly is that we identified basically two distinct dimensions. So basically school value added on social well-being. Questions predict well-being throughout secondary school, as you'd expect. School value added on questions that relate to working hard, schools that promote hard work. They predict whether students report working hard all the way through high secondary school, 9th grade, all the way through 12th grade. And then school value added on sort of social well-being and work hard questions actually both predict test scores all the way through secondary school. So we find that this is going to come back to the behaviors, that these school impacts on these self-reported measures actually are pretty strongly associated with some of those behaviors I mentioned before. So the takeaway from this slide is basically schools that are able to increase answers to the working hard dimension have pretty large impacts on whether students are on track. On track is basically an indicator that was developed by the Consortium for Public School Research at University of Chicago, and it's a very strong predictor of whether students graduate from secondary school. The work hard dimension is a very strong predictor of that. It's also a very strong predictor of students' grades in 9th grade, and this is in fact it's a stronger predictor of a school's impact on on grades than school impacts on test scores. So school value added in terms of test scores is not as good a predictor of school impacts on grades as school impacts on these survey measures of working hard. The other sort of dimension is the sort of social well-being dimension. School impacts on the social well-being dimension has a strong predictive power for predicting schools that reduce the likelihood that students have disciplinary incidents. And also it is a strong predictor of schools that reduce absences as well. And again, these are much larger effects than you'd observe from using school impacts on test scores. So sort of the punchline of this paper is, if you tried to predict school impacts on longer run outcomes, the outcomes we look at are whether a student graduates high school, whether they enroll in college, whether they enroll in a 2-year college, and also whether they enroll in a 4-year college. As what these bars are showing you is how large of an effect can we predict if we use only test score value added. That's sort of what we see on the far left. What happens if we start using the social impact value added? What happens if we start using the value added on the work hard dimension? And what happens if we start using all three together as a sort of combined index? And the first thing you see is that using all measures, both test score measures and these sort of psychometric measures, we can explain a lot more of the school impact on these long-run outcomes using all three rather than just using test scores alone. And in most cases, we can explain about twice as much of the variation of the school impacts on these important outcomes using a combined measure than just using test scores alone. So there's a lot of information about the effect that schools are having on long-run outcomes, college going into a four-year college that we're not picking up if we use test scores alone. And just to give you sort of to put that into perspective, we're finding here, if you sort of just look at going to four-year colleges, going to a school at the sort of average of the distribution in terms of test score value added compared to going to one at the 85th percentile. So an average school, the one that's very effective at improving test scores, students, that's associated with being about 2 percentage points more likely to enroll in a four-year college. Now, if we did the same thing where we said, what about a school that's really effective at raising test scores and improving these socio-emotional measures as well? That goes from about 2 percentage points to about 3.5 percentage points. So we're getting a lot better at identifying those schools that are having sizable impacts on the likelihood that individuals go to college by using measures beyond test scores in conjunction with the test scoring past themselves. So that sort of concludes the research, and I look forward to having questions and relating this to all the things that you guys are thinking about.
Perfect. That was fascinating. I hope for everyone who is moving into the social and emotional learning space from the teachers and testing space, this is super relevant. And so I wanted to say a couple things. Number one, thank you, Dr. Jackson. Fascinating. Number two, for those of you who have joined since we first began, please feel free to throw questions into the chat box. I will make sure that those questions get out here over the course of time. I have 1 million at this point, and I've written them all down, so I'll take over if folks don't have a lot of questions. But what I'd love to do is now turn it over to Janet Lopez from the Rose Community Foundation, and I asked Janet to join us because I know that for a long time the Rose Community Foundation has been a funder who's looked at these issues of teachers, issues of policy, and has also kind of gone through the process of rethinking their strategy over the past year or so, and are really thinking about more broadly about, what does success look like in schools. And so I would love for Janet to just share a few reflections of the Rose Community Foundation's journey, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Celine. Thanks to GFE, and thank you to Dr. Jackson for the opportunity to sort of be part of today's conversation. As Celine mentioned, I think I'll just tell you all a little bit about the foundation's history, sort of related to teacher-focused grant making, how sort of our thinking has evolved, and I think really how this research informs our work. And I think I'm excited for everybody to talk about how it informs philanthropic work beyond obviously just our foundation. So Rose is a community foundation that will celebrate our 25th year in 2020. And we were a conversion foundation from the sale of the Rose Hospital. And all of our grant making has historically been centered around the idea of creating sort of a healthy and vibrant Denver community. And we have two areas of grant making that touch education, both K-12 and early childhood. And my portfolio has historically centered on both teacher effectiveness and systemic change, to try to think about how we impact the opportunity and the achievement gap. And we have historically focused, there's 7 different school districts within Metro Denver, with Denver Public Schools being the largest. But we've also done a statewide body of policy work when we can sort of make an argument that policy at the statewide level is going to impact the Front Range. And we also have a third area, which I want to talk about sort of at the end of my reflections, of direct service grant making that's around Outofschooltime Partners, that I actually think has a connection to Dr. Jackson's research about sort of adults having impact on students. So early, sort of just to share with you a little bit about our evolution, early in the history of our foundation, my predecessor, there have only been 2 program officers in education over our 25-year history, but my predecessor, Phil Gondering, who was a teacher himself, felt very strongly around sort of looking at the early research 25 years ago and saying to the board, if we've got one shot to really be able to help think about the long-term success of a student, the teacher is it. And so he really took the foundation, I think, and was a pioneer in terms of focusing on educators and really thinking about it as one of the most critical sort of variables in impacting the student's life. Phil also felt very strongly about sort of the professionalization of teaching, and his signature work was really focused around could we professionalize teaching? And his signature sort of project and the foundation's project in the early 90s was building a merit-based pay system in partnership. That system, ProComp, which many of you know about, was you know, that's a whole different webinar that we could spend time talking about, but there were a lot of successes, there were a lot of shortcomings related to that, but it was sort of the body of work that we did when we started. I came to the foundation in 2009 and sort of didn't play that much with the areas we focused on, but started in 2000 and 2014, wanted to sort of be able to think about tightening up our teacher portfolio. And our teacher portfolio has historically been very agnostic about where teachers worked and what kids were being served. Great teachers were great teachers and having an impact on kids wherever they went. But we really took time to sort of shift and look at who were the students that weren't getting great teachers, and we knew that and who were the kids in the system that weren't being served well, and what did the research say about the kind of teachers that they needed. And we really came out on the other side, deciding to really dig into the issue, and were inspired really by the research about teachers of color. And you know, there's a whole big body of research. I think the Learning Policy Institute has a pretty good summary. I'm happy to share resources around that. But I think that the research on teachers of color, similar to Dr. Jackson's incredible research, is really showing impact around sort of larger factors than just test scores, and thinking about teachers of color not only, you know, having a positive impact on higher, but also that those same teachers are more likely to have students of color, you know, graduate from high school at higher rates, and I think more likely to succeed in college. So I think we have really evolved in thinking about who are those adults that serve as role models and really are supporting students, you know, around their attachment to school, their success in school, and their learning beyond just the test score. And so we've sort of focused on two things, I think, thinking about promising pathways and a grow your own sort of talent focus. And I think also, how do we really improve school conditions? And we've thought a lot about school leadership in relationship to what is the experience that in particular teachers and teachers of color are having. So as I've, you know, read Dr. Jackson's work, had the opportunity to do that in anticipation of this, I think there are some really big buckets for us, and I think for education philanthropy in general, that really inform our thinking specific to, I think, recruitment and retention of teachers writ large, not just teachers of color. So there's sort of three things. One, I think regarding systems work and policy change, Dr. Jackson's research has really showed us that for the purpose of assessing teacher performance, that we have to start considering a broader range of student skills and start thinking about what are we looking at in terms of mixed sort of measurement, and thinking about observations in classrooms, and sort of just a broader set of skills that we're looking for in teachers. And I want to share an example sort of at the end specific to Colorado's teacher evaluation law and a project. I think regarding teacher recruitment, Dr. Jackson's research really has helped me think about, you know, to consider carefully what are the skills that teachers are gaining in teacher preparation programs and alternative certification programs, and what is the amount of attention that is being paid to both those academic and non-cognitive factors, and how are we sort of measuring teachers, how they're developing those skills and growing their skills as they prepare to enter the classroom, and obviously once they are supported in terms of being in the classroom. And then finally, I would just say, I think that the research has really interesting implications as we think about other adults that aren't teachers that are shaping the lives of students in schools. And so I would just say at Rose, you know, we have a portfolio of out-of-school-time partners, and we think a lot about when I look at that portfolio and look at the impact that students, I feel like a lot of the different sort of a lot of the measurements that Dr. Jackson is looking at is actually the expectations I have around my out of school time partners and youth development partners. And so I'm thinking about it from sort of my perspective about what do those really high quality enrichment partners, what do they have to actually teach schools and teachers about, you know, the kind of outcomes that they're getting with kids, and are we thinking about opportunities for those sort of non-teachers to have opportunities to convene them and to bring them together and to have them learn from each other, and how can we make that happen? And to close, I just kind of wanted to share one very sort of specific policy implication. We have been doing for the last 18 months at our foundation a project, I like to call it the worst named project ever. It's called Teacher Informed Solutions and Performance Evaluation, or TISP. Sometimes we call it TIPSY. But we have been doing a project to try to get teacher input in anticipation of our legislative session, which has just started here in Colorado 2 days ago. And we wanted to get an opportunity for teachers from across the state to be able to make recommendations around policy changes to Colorado's teacher evaluation law. Many of you may know that Colorado has a very stringent teacher evaluation law where almost 50% is based on a combination of sort of value-added test scores. And we wanted teachers to be able to explore both the sort of limitations and the possibilities within the current law, and to also make recommendations around policy changes. And so they have been running micropilots across the state for the last year around what changes they would make. And so I wanted to just share that I think a set of their recommendations from this project that are being brought forward to the legislature have a lot of overlap with, and I think can really be informed by Dr. Jackson's research, with, in particular, the ability to change and make changes, and I think positive changes to our teacher evaluation law. They made the recommendation that the new system, or any changes to our teacher evaluation law, have to really be oriented to actual teacher growth. And so I think about how does Dr. Jackson's research and thinking about those behavioral skills, how would that sort of impact what we think about in terms of teacher growth? Second, many of the teachers placed a lot of value in observations from their peers and also strong training for evaluators that are evaluating them. And I think about, in terms of Dr. Jackson's results, how would we train evaluators differently to provide feedback to teachers to be able to really help increase the non-cognitive behaviors and the abilities that they are growing within their students. There is total agreement from the teachers in Colorado that Dr. Jackson's research, is saying we have to think about multiple perspectives and multiple data points. And it really sort of leads to, teachers in Colorado, and I'm sure nationally, want a more customized evaluation system. And so I've been thinking a lot in hearing your remarks, Dr. Jackson, about what states will lead the way to think about other indicators than just value-added indicators. And then the final thing I'll say, and I'm really excited to sort of just kick off the discussion, is that I think it should come as no surprise that, teachers, a group of 50 to 100 teachers in Colorado, confirm what very sophisticated economists and large data sets tell us all. And just that, we need to be focusing more on social emotional learning. And teachers here in Colorado, they pushed even harder to say, how do we think more clearly about standards in our state around those issues? And really thinking about, they're willing to think about what are those factors that could be used in service of, teacher growth in terms of performance evaluation. So I think that's it for my remarks, and excited to jump in.
Perfect. Well, I think this is a really great tee up, because I think that what you both did was said the research is pretty clear, And teachers themselves are pretty clear that we need to take these other factors, social and emotional factors, into consideration. Okay, so now let's talk about what does that mean then for schools and what we do in schools. What does it mean for policy? What does it mean for ed schools? What does it mean for philanthropy? This is super exciting. So why don't we start with one of the questions that's come into the chat. And this is for Dr. Jackson. Have you thought about how measures of SEL types of measures and outcomes might behave differently if they are associated with high stakes? Great question, right? So value add, this idea of looking at test scores as a dipstick, then kind of took on this huge life of its own. What are you worried about? How could this go bad?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's one that I get a lot, and it's one that I'm concerned about. So one thing to sort of point out, which I mentioned to people a lot, is that there is always going to be some sort of manipulation that goes on. So, once you attach stakes to pretty much anything, you're providing incentives for individuals to improve that thing that you're measuring, perhaps to the detriment of things that you're not measuring. And that's always true. So that's one thing that you sort of worry about. The other thing you worry about is that people may start investing time and effort to improve the thing you're measuring in ways that are actually not productive, which perhaps I think is what the heart of the question. In the case of test scores, you can see that there's cheating, for example. It does happen from time to time. And I think with these socio-emotional measures and also behaviors, you have that same problem as well. So yeah, if you start saying, well, we'll give teachers bonuses if they do well in terms of getting students to show up to school on time, that may actually be a valuable thing. So I think that may be one that's less easy to manipulate. So if you can get kids to actually just show up, and if attendance is something you're measuring, that may be something that's actually valuable, as long as the students, are actually in the room, their butts in the seats, they're there to listen, that may help. But in terms of improving their scores or their grades, teachers may start to say, well, maybe I can just start giving A's to everyone, and that's not actually improving their skills. I'm just inflating their grades. And that's going to be a problem. And I think that's always going to be an issue to worry about. Certainly, I think a lot of careful thought has to be given to exactly what it is that we're measuring and to what extent it can be manipulated or not, in terms of the question of whether we should attach stakes to them or not. So that's something that I'm concerned about. It's something that I have thought of, and I think it's something that I don't really have the answers to, so to speak. To a large extent, I think my research is kind of unsatisfying in the sense that I think I raise maybe more questions than I answer. I think what I think my papers show is kind of like a proof of concept that there are things out there that matter a ton, and they matter more than test scores, and we should pay attention to them. But the question is getting at the heart of the policy implication, which is so where do we go next? I think there's some things we can do. So I think in terms of self-reports, we could start thinking about coming up with ways to measure students' sort of academic orientation in ways that are less likely to be subject to reporting biases. We could imagine asking parents to give answers as opposed to students. That may be one way to sort of get around it. But I think it's a tough question that it's going to take a long time to figure that out. Yeah.
Can you cite any examples of where this is changing the policy conversation? And if so, in what ways? And I will also note that there's another question in the chat box. So why don't you try that one, and then I'll read the one in the chat box.
Just the use of other measures. Well, I mean, I think I know there are a lot of school districts now, and certainly individual schools and school districts like the Castle City rolling out surveys every year to try and measure a lot of these socio-emotional learning measures. I don't think any of them are using them for evaluation just yet, which I think is a good thing. But a lot of schools are also just rolling out socio-emotional learning into their curriculum. I know that's certainly true. As I go through, it's sort of always kind of fun when I go and look at schools. Chicago has a school choice system, and look at schools, and you hear the principals talk about, we We have a growth mindset sort of module that we do, and we have these, they may have apps where they sort of teach students about grit. So I think a lot of these socio-emotional components are being rolled out into curriculum. Now, I think there's a question, a very reasonable question about whether we can really measure the success of those things using these measures. I think that's kind of where I think the research is going. But my sense is that there is a lot to be learned. I don't know that we're going to be able to give the final sort of policy relevant answer today or tomorrow in a year's time. But I think there's a lot of, I think we know that there's going to be a big payoff to figuring this thing out. And this is where I think having philanthropists out there who are willing to fund a lot of the basic research just to sort of experiment would be really, really valuable. So one of the things that I often say when I talk to philanthropists in general, when they say, what is the one thing you'd want to spend money on? Oftentimes I say, I don't think the way to think about it, from my perspective at least, is what is the next best thing. I think the way to think about it is we have to be willing to experiment and we have to be willing to fail. So there's going to be many things that we're going to try to fund that may not work out, and that's okay because we learned something from that. So my sense is that we know, based on sort of the proof of concept research, that there is going to be a big payoff if you can figure out how to measure this stuff and leverage it for policy. And figuring out exactly the most effective way to do that is going to require a lot of experimentation. And we're not there yet.
I was just going to sort of, in terms of like the conversation happening at district level, Denver Public Schools has had the school performance framework, which is really the SPF is really the accountability framework. And they last year, I think that community, I think it was, mostly external pressure from, but frankly, I think parents and families to say, we don't think that the SPF is covering everything that's really important and core to us. So it's interesting, they've launched this year, a year-long process to really be able to say, these are the current things that are, and what is on the table. And so I think that this conversation about what are the measurement tools we would, if we want to get to a point within the accountability framework for the whole district, that what social emotional learning, where does that fit? If we wanted to use it. And it's so hard because policy is one tool. It is the one tool in reality. So, but it's interesting because that is a very real time happening, over the course of this next in Denver Public Schools. And, I assume that many things probably will change within the SPF probably in the next year or so. And one thing I was just going to share sort of in relationship to that I mentioned about the out-of-school-time partners is I do think that actually folks that are working within the youth development space in many ways are looking at, I'm often interested when I review my direct service grantees, some of the measurement tools that they're using. And I feel like they are thinking about it a little more differently than we have historically thought at this level. So I just wonder, what can we be looking and learning from that particular community within, enrichment partnerships and development.
So I wanted to add one more, just to be less pessimistic about the policy implications here, is that, so I do think there are two issues. One is that it's not necessarily the case that in order for something to be valuable for policy, that it has to be used for evaluation. I don't think that's necessarily true. We can identify problems without using it as a bludgeon to figure out, who to fire or what school to shut down. We can use it to identify policies that work or practices that work. So one of the things that I'm actively engaged in now is trying to figure out, once we identify schools that are effective at improving the socio-emotional measures or teachers that are particularly effective at improving these things, is linking it with really rich data on, say, what they may be doing in the classroom, what are the school practices that are in place that are associated with these improvements. So, if you can identify practices that teachers can engage in that we know tends to move the needle on these socio-emotional measures, and we sort of identify this in a no-stakes environment, then, we don't have to directly provide incentives for teachers to raise socio-emotional measures directly. We can say, well, these are the things that we know you should be doing. We can incorporate those practices into training. We can incorporate those practices into evaluations. we can provide incentives for teachers to engage in those practices or schools to engage in those practices that we document tend to move the needle in terms of the things that we care about. So on the one hand, I think manipulation is certainly a problem if you attach direct stakes to it in terms of making sure schools and teachers improve it. But I think if you think broadly about something being useful for policy, it can be very, very valuable for just identifying effective practices without necessarily introducing the problems of manipulation.
That ties to another question in the chat around, are there other ways of measuring SEL beyond surveys and observations? Are there any practices? I know this kind of is more fine-grained than economic research, but are there some that are emerging, things that you see?
I'm aware of a movement to start to do they're called real effort tasks to sort of measure these skills. I'm intrigued by the idea. The idea would be that, instead of asking a student whether they're gritty or not, you actually have them perform some kind of task, and then you can observe how gritty they are. And the task could be something as straightforward as, you observe them playing a math game, and you can observe how many math questions they decide to do on their own. And that might be sort of a way to measure their grit without having to ask them if they're gritty or not. And that gets around some of the manipulation issues. It also gets around some reporting biases that have been documented for some of these measured things as well. So those types of measures have the flavor of kind of being like behaviors without some of the ill effects that we tend to observe when it comes to using these psychometric measures on surveys. So they do exist. I've not seen, they're certainly not used widespread in schools, but I think there's potentially some promise there.
So that brings me to my next question, and this can be for both of you. So I feel like this set of learnings is really profound, and a really profound shift from where we were not long ago. Any evidence that ed schools are taking note of this, that teacher training programs are taking note of this? Janet, I imagine you intersect with teacher training programs. We know that as soon as good research comes out, they pivot their behaviors, or maybe not. So any comments there? Number one, on if this is kind of making its way into teacher training programs, and if not, how should it? What would be the ideal?
Is that for me or for Janet?
I think it can be for both of you, honestly. I think that you probably have different intersections with teacher training programs in different ways.
I mean, my sense is that certainly some of it is. I probably interact with a very, with a selected sample, but my sense from talking to, people at ed schools is that there certainly is attention to this idea that we need to attend to a broader set of skills for the child or for the students, and that there is definitely attention paid to the kinds of things that are happening in the classroom in terms of just facilitating conversations that are going to be more inclusive and generate more feelings of belonging and that sort of thing. That's certainly something that I think has been around for a while, and I think is becoming increasingly so.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that my experience with the sort of different ed prep, the hard part is that what I find in either alternative certification programs that are, the ones that we've invested in, and traditional ed prep, is that nobody is, they're all really good at something, but they're not doing all the things they need to do. And so, they're doing great around, culturally responsive teaching, but, you hear them saying, well, I've heard one ed prep program, well, they're great around that, but actually, how do you actually teach math to a student who's a native Spanish speaker, like the sort of core academic content skills, and really good with the culturally responsive, and so or really good with classroom management. I hear, the alt prep programs, I think some of them are great with classroom management, but some of the, so I think that's the hard part, is like, how do you balance within ed prep, all the things that actually to get to those multiple measures of how do you get in that sweet spot that Dr. Jackson had of like teachers that are really good at like both of those things that he's talking about. And what I found is that, most programs are good at some element, but not holistic. So hard.
Yeah. Back to Dr. Jackson's, I believe it was first slide, and my last question. So, so Dr. Jackson, you talked about the kind of two different conceptions of what makes a good teacher. So there are two schools of thought, right? One is that a teacher prepares students in their content area to be successful in that content area. And the other is a good teacher prepares students for life. I have a different way of asking that whenever I start a course, which is what is a teacher responsible for, their content area or all things? And I feel like over time, I've watched that shift to everyone saying teachers are responsible for all things. So that's great. And at the same time, I have to worry, are we making the job less doable, less attractive, less possible to be successful at? Any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, that is a great question. I've definitely heard people refer to this sort of mission creep idea, and I think that is true. I mean, my personal view is that I think it's okay if. Well, let me take a step back and say, I think the role of schools and the role of teachers can be different. So one of the things that I think could happen, and perhaps we'll end up in this way, is that, as the school as an environment is there to educate perhaps the whole child, and that mission, I think, certainly has changed over time. Perhaps as we've started to identify, large gaps in achievement across populations, we start to realize, well, you can't just focus on the sort of the numeracy and literacy skills. You have to sort of look at the basic stuff as well. I think we definitely do more of that, but I don't know that all has to happen. It does not all have to be on the back of the teacher. I think there are other adults in the building that can absolutely attend to those issues. I think we can have more counselors, more individuals who are able to deal with mental health issues. And I'm getting into a completely different literature at this point, but the additional adults in the room matter a lot. I've seen some recent evidence looking at sort of, say, just like guidance counselors, and they have pretty large effects on students. So it doesn't all have to fall on the back of the individual teacher. Another thing that I think many successful models of schools tend to have is that the teachers do not operate as individual actors in the building. Some of the most successful school models are ones where teachers operate as teams. So teachers, so in some cases, the students, if you're in a high school or a middle school, all the teachers who attend to the same sets of students will have meetings about what the students are doing, how they're going, what's going on there, and they come up with plans to deal with the students. In other cases, even if you're in the elementary school setting where you have the same teacher throughout the whole day, teachers get together and discuss practices, they discuss ways, they discuss the students they have issues with. So, I think that the model of teachers as being kind of like Lego blocks, you take them from one place and you put them somewhere else and it fits the same way, it's got the same bumps, is probably a little bit misguided. I think they operate in a context. And I think that to the extent that, education becomes a little bit more or schools are more like learning communities, and some of them are, and some of them are less so. I think some of these responsibilities will be distributed across the teaching or across the educator space in ways that I think will actually be manageable. But I absolutely agree that it's probably untenable that every teacher has to be able to plan a lesson, they have to be able to deliver a lesson, they have to be a counselor, they have to be surrogate mom in some cases. I think in many cases that's something that's going to be very difficult, and probably there are ways to deal with that these responsibilities can be distributed elsewhere.
Janet, I'll give you the last
word. I was just going to share, sort of from the point of knowing that most of the folks on the webinar are grant makers. I think it is, to your sort of original question, I don't think the teacher can be, but I guess in a best case scenario, a school could be that, the counselor, the enrichments, all the staff in the building,
school time
partner. And so I would just say, as we've looked at like our strategic plan, we've always been super focused on teachers because we have limited dollars to be able to make an impact. And the tension of like, if we know that it's bigger and more holistic and we have to be able to impact all of that, how do we do grant making that way? And if we have a limited set of resources, how do we fight the tension of, well, if I want to make an impact, that, we've just always said, like, the teachers are our priority, and we're not necessarily, attending to the other parts, other components. So just, it's an interesting tension of, like, if you know the answer is the whole school, and how do you make those decisions enough to make an impact? So
I think that's exactly right. Well, this got me the lecture that I was dying for. I think it's fascinating and super important to the way that we are evolving as a field of K-12 education. I think Janet's points in the end about it does raise lots of challenging questions about then where does philanthropy fit in and use their limited dollars, whether it's just for teachers in these issues or whether it's all of the surrounding supports in the school. These are great things for us to tackle together in the future. So thank you both, and thank you all for joining. Have a great rest of the day.